Today I wanted to talk about some first principles, you could say, in the teachings of the Yifa Society, and which are also kind of the first principles of the spiritual system that is underlying the structure of the I Ching, which I mention a little bit about in the Magician's I Ching, although the Magician's I Ching is mostly a practical guide meant for the point of view of contemplation and divination. I don't go too deeply in the book itself about kind of the aspects of it for spiritual cultivation. I do mention that I think it's very important that unless you're engaged in some kind of a path of cultivation, of spiritual practice, which includes something that is a form of meditation practice, then you're going to have a very hard time understanding the deeper mysteries of the I Ching. And I've talked a little bit about these sorts of things before, but I don't think I've done a video where I get down to the very basic core of what cultivation practice is and what the basic method or the basic system is, the first principles. I know that some of you probably want to see more videos about the I Ching hexagrams or about the runes or in the Bhagavad Gita series. And I will keep doing those, but I've also had a feeling that you need that there are some people that would like some more of these kinds of commentary videos where I talk about some of these concepts and how they should be understood and applied. So the first thing to understand when I'm talking about the I Ching, I'm talking about not just the I Ching as a divination technique, but as a spiritual guidebook. And it's really one of the earliest spiritual guidebooks we have still in use. And it's a guidebook that formed the foundational concepts that you see in all forms of Chinese esoteric teaching. You see it in the Taoist teaching, and you see it in the Confucian teaching, and you see it also even in the Chinese Buddhist teachings, which adopted some concepts from the I Ching. So none of the I Ching is older than any of these, and they borrowed from it. And in the Yifa Society, we use these kind of basic principles as the guidance to a complete system of spiritual development, of spiritual cultivation. So I've talked a lot, I think, in previous videos. I've mentioned Qi when I'm talking about the Qigong practices, which are a part of the Yifa cultivation system. The practicing of Qigong is very important. I've talked about the superior individual and the inferior person, and I've talked about the virtue and the four facets of virtue. But I thought I should try to get more into that to help you understand it better. These are things we talk a lot about inside the Yifa Society. But in the Yifa Society, we talk about ways to apply this in a practical way in the system, in the curriculum of teaching and of practices, so that you can achieve cultivation, which is not always as simple as it seems. But there are some very basic concepts which bring with them, as a default, very simple things that you should be doing that I think you could do even if you're not working within a kind of a mystery school like the Yifa Society. So maybe some of you will be interested in the Yifa Society, and if you are, please get in touch with me to have a kind of a complete system with supervised teaching. But some of you might also just be able to get some things out of this that are useful as teaching for you. And the way I'm going to do this is really by just talking about some very basic definitions and then some very basic things that you can do. And I suppose the first two definitions we should talk about here are the core elements, the core forces that you work with in a system of internal alchemy, which is the same in other schools of alchemy in the West or things like that, but or in India, in Indian systems, but they'll have different names to them. So in the Yifa Society and in the whole context of internal cultivation schools that are descended from the I Ching, you could say, there are a couple of concepts that have emerged, neither of which are actually explicitly stated in the I Ching itself, but which emerged as useful terminology to discuss some of the processes that are in the I Ching. And so the first of these is called Qi. And I know I've talked about Qi before. The other one is called De, which means virtue. Qi means, literally it means breath, right? But a lot of people in the West somewhat unfortunately translate it as energy, right? You can also talk about it as will. You can talk about it as attention. So basically, these are the two elements in which you operate, the two ingredients you're constantly working with in a system of cultivation. And Qi has to do with your awareness level, your power of attention. So when you're doing meditation, any real meditation is in some way or another allowing you to accumulate Qi within yourself. This is a concept, it's an idea of, let's call it attention or let's call it will, as if it was a substance rather than just a concept. And of course, in some schools, this is treated very literally, and in others, it's treated very symbolically. And the fact is that I think both of these are useful, right? And if you want to treat it absolutely literally, you can. If you have trouble with that, you're probably going to find that as you work in cultivation practice, that trouble you might have with it will become challenged, because you'll find that there are elements to what is Qi and to your experiences of Qi that can't be just explained as, oh, this is a symbolic concept. But there's no problem with you understanding it as a symbolic concept first and foremost, and understanding that by working within that concept and working with your attention, you absolutely do not have to think about some kind of blobby universal new age energy that's out there. In fact, that's probably counterproductive. You should think of it as something that's on the inside of you, right? And that you bring into you, that's around you, only in the sense that it has to do with how you are attending to yourself, being present in your body, being present in your surroundings. So that's Qi. And I guess if you really wanted to super simplify, you could call it energy. But I think that is a very simplistic and sometimes an unfortunate definition. And then the other side, De, would be translated as virtue. And virtue is also a very problematic term, right? It's a term that implies with it a lot of stuff that people in the West, especially esoteric people, sometimes have a problem with, right? And you kind of end up seeing this situation. One of the reasons why there's so many people that have trouble with cultivation practice is that you get a lot of people who are spiritual but not religious that love Qi, but they really don't like virtue, right? And then you have a bunch of people who are religious but not spiritual that really like virtue but aren't too keen on Qi, right? And the truth of the matter is both of these are vastly misinterpreted, right? Virtue is not a set of rules that come from above. It is basically meant to represent natural law, the state of reality as it really is, and those laws that we can derive from our actual existence. And Qi is not really some kind of blobby force-like energy that we can use to do magic tricks. It's our ability to be attentive, and within the context of that, to how conscious we are, okay? So to cultivate, you need both of these things. Because if you're just doing Qi practices, if you're just doing Qigong or meditation or balancing your chakras or whatever you want to call it, but you're not actually engaging in doing something that is in congress with the natural state of the world, and trying to bring more of those natural laws to rectify the world within the context of those natural laws, then you're just living in this kind of little whirligig fantasy that goes nowhere, right? If you're trying to apply virtue without developing inner awareness, then you're probably dangerous, right? You're going to make huge mistakes. You might not think they are, but they will be, right? Because you will lack the awareness to know what you're doing, right? Another definition of virtue is power. De can mean power, and it can also mean virtue, right? Or law, or what have you. So there is a power in developing inner virtue. And again, this virtue isn't because of, some kind of 10 commandments or something like that. What virtue is how connected you are to the natural state of the universe. And key is how connected you are to your own being and consciousness. And you have to cultivate both at the same time. And you have to cultivate both in an applied way. You can't just be thinking about it, right? You can't just be spending your time thinking about white light or something like that. And you can't spend your time just thinking about morality or something like a philosopher or something like that. You have to actually be engaging in them. You engage with Qi by doing practices that directly connect your awareness to the here and now and to your own body. That's why Qigong is such an effective system, because it's a system that connects you to your own body. It puts the mind kind of in the back seat, and your body is the front seat. Your consciousness is in your body and in the here and now. And so you're not going off in flights of fantasy. You're connecting in a profound way to these levels of what is the immediate reality of the here and now that you didn't see before. And virtue is connected in the I Ching to these four concepts that are tied to Yuan Hong Li Jun, which are the first four words of the I Ching. The Yuan Hong Li Jun means well, in the I Ching itself, it's translated as supreme celestial forces in motion, right? But these connect to a number of particular qualities in the traditional kind of esoteric thought, which are, you can define them as union, discipline, balance or harmony, and truth. So those are the four things you have to most develop and you have to most apply in your life. You can't just develop them in the sense of thinking they're really nice, right? You have to go out and do them. You have to engage with them. So how to engage them would probably be too long for this video, but I want to tell you about how to maybe start to engage with them. And one of the first things you have to develop is discipline, right? In the Yi Fa Society, we begin the process. The level 1 of the Yi Fa Society is all about connecting to your own sense of discipline. And a lot of people in the West have a lot of trouble with discipline, in the modern or postmodern world, I should say, because they see discipline as something imposed from outside by hierarchy, authority, which is implicitly invalid and trying to impose rules on you, and you have to follow dogmas or things like that. Discipline has nothing to do with any of that, actually. And this brings us to another pair of things that we have to define, which are the superior individual and the inferior person. In the I Ching, you see repeated references. In other versions of the book, it's sometimes, English translations, it's sometimes called the great man and the lesser man or something like that. I chose to call it the superior individual and the inferior person. So one of the things that I Ching teaches, being all about how to understand, how to see time through this very moment, right? And how in each moment, the nature of time is such that in each moment you have a choice, and that choice leads to possible directions in the future. And therefore, those possible directions already exist in an incipient way in the present. All of those choices can be basically summarized as one single idea. Do you manifest at this moment as the inferior person or as the superior individual, right? So the inferior person is essentially you failing to live up to what you could possibly live up to, right? It's you choosing to be small and limited, choosing to be driven by your desires, choosing to be driven by your social influences. Whereas the superior individual, it's a very complex concept, which has equivalents, again, in all the kind of esoteric teachings in the West, of the holy guardian angel, the Goides, and things like that. But let's put it very, very simply. You can, on a practical level, you can see the superior individual as being your best possible self, okay? So at any moment, you have a choice between doing or trying to do that which represents your best possible self in the context of the situation you're in right now, which is going to be different in every other situation. At any given moment, there's not just a blanket rule of what the superior individual can do. In the I Ching, you have in the 64 hexagrams, which represent these different elements of things that can occur in space-time. You have 64 different very broad descriptions of what the superior individual should do in that given circumstance, if that's the circumstance that is governing the situation at hand, right? So your superior individual represents this kind of higher will in the sense of what is it that you are really meant to do? What is it that you're really supposed to do as a person? What's your place in the context of the world, right? Your true will. And so first you have to know what that will is, but that's not very easy. That's hard. It takes a lot of work because you're working against the inferior person, which is the product of all the impulses, the conditionings, the social conditionings, your fears, your desires, and all those other things that have created this false persona around you that are meant to protect you and keep you safe and give you the illusion that you're the center of the universe when you really aren't, right? And so it's very, very hard sometimes. The superior individual isn't just something that, oh, and even when you discover it, it's not just, oh, now I'm, everything is everything is roses and I get to do what I really want. Because a lot of times what you think you really want as the inferior person has nothing to do with what you're really meant to do as the superior individual. So it can be very hard. And practicing cultivation with qi, with meditation, is one way that you gradually become more and more connected to understanding what that superior individual is about. And then practicing virtue in the world, not just for yourself, not just being true for yourself or being united for yourself, listen, loving yourself, or being disciplined for yourself, or being harmonious for yourself, but doing this for the world, for the people around you, for your environment, bringing those things into your family life, your work life, your social life, and in a bigger sense, in terms of trying to bring it to the world as a whole, that allows you in turn to develop greater awareness. The more aware you are, the more virtue you can accumulate and practice and use, right? Because again, virtue, just like qi, is thought of here as a substance, not as as just an idea. It's not a belief. Virtue isn't what you believe. Virtue is something you accumulate through your choices and through your actions. The more you practice virtue, the more virtue you can accumulate. The more qi you develop through your meditation practice, the more virtue you're capable of accumulating and directing in useful ways that accumulate more virtue. So these two things work on each other. And if you're not using one, then the other one gets stunted. So this is why it's important to use both. And the first thing you need above all else to be able to do that is discipline. Discipline doesn't really have anything to do with following other people's rules, with following dogmas, or following external ideas. Discipline is you knowing the will of your superior individual, of your best possible self, and then knowing the choice you need to take at any given moment to further that will, and then taking that choice, even though at any given moment it might be hard to do. It might be that you want to do something else or you don't want to do anything at all. And there's lots of times when you will know that that's the case, right? Where you'll have this feeling that you just, you can't be bothered, or you're afraid, or you're lazy, or you're in denial, or that that's going to be complicated, and so you don't want to live up to that superior individual. So a lot of spiritual power has to do with living up to, as much as you can, that superior individual. Whereas a loss of spiritual power happens every time that you compromise that you fail to live up to that. And that can sound like a really big standard, right? But the fact is that every little bit that you do that is going to work to make it easier to do it the next time. So you don't have to start out by being some kind of a perfect person, because you're never going to be a perfect person. Human nature is flawed, right? And in fact, the superior individual isn't a perfect person. It's your best possible person. But by definition, because you're human and because being imperfect is part of being human, if you weren't imperfect, you couldn't grow. You're always going to have that imperfection. So you can't put this huge weight on yourself, because discipline is also not about guilting yourself. It's just about knowing that you have to make those hard choices, knowing that the bigger picture, it's part of getting you to where you want to be and getting you to becoming who you want to be, to transforming yourself. You won't do that if you don't make those little choices. It's not about making some sudden big change. It's about, at this moment, what is the choice to follow the superior individual? And if you have the slightest bit of truth within yourself, right? If you have the least bit of attention, then you'll know when the moment of choice comes. If you're aware of the moment of choice, you'll recognize it. And if you're at that level where you can at least recognize those moments you have choice, sometimes, maybe you won't recognize it all the time at first, but if sometimes you recognize that you have that choice, then you will know whether you're, what is the way to be strong? What is the way to have to use power, that is to say virtue, or what is the way to fail? What is the way to go the path of the inferior person? And then it becomes about bringing yourself to do it, directing yourself to act in the way that brings virtue through yourself to your choices and therefore into the world. And you can often know this even if you don't have to have it all worked out. You don't even have to have a lot of it worked out. You just have to be engaging in the most basic level of some kind of practice of self-awareness. And you have to have at least a little bit of honest self-inquiry, of being honest about yourself and with yourself, right? And if you can do that, even if you haven't worked out everything else, in your life, or in terms of your ideas, or even sometimes you may not, have worked out intellectually or mentally what your actual bigger will is, in the sense of where does this ultimately lead? What's the end goal? But so you might not know what the end goal really is, or what your ultimate purpose, so to say, is, where you're directing yourself towards. But you'll know the direction. At this moment, in this little choice, you'll have an inherent understanding, if you have enough of that level of awareness, of which choice it is going to get you closer to that direction that you may not even know what the destination is. So you may not know the destination, but if you engage in just a little bit of self-awareness, then you'll damn well know what'll move you just a little bit further along that path, or what would not. So if you can take anything out of this, if you're not, let's say you're not going to join the Yi Fa Society, or apply to join, because not everyone can join, because we're not one of these big movements or something like that. You need to be at a certain place, and you need to have a certain level of seriousness to be in the Yi Fa Society. But let's say that right now you're not there, or that you don't want to be there. I hope that you can take from this video that idea of what I've just talked about, of being able to understand how at any moment you have that choice to manifest the superior individual or the inferior person. And you have a choice about whether you want to manifest your virtue or not, and how, and what I talked about, how you can get there, right? Practice, you don't have to practice a lot of it. Even just a little bit of some kind of an awareness practice. Look at my video on key breathing. Just do that, right? And then work on being more truthful with yourself and with others, and on being more disciplined in the sense I've described discipline here, which is of an inner discipline, of understanding that you yourself know what you are meant to do in terms of your discipline. And if you do those things, you're going to see significant transformation. If you haven't done those before, you're going to see a very significant transformation for yourself if you can start to develop that with any amount of regularity, with any amount of regular discipline, of making those kinds of choices. That will make a big change in your life. So thank you very much for listening. Please subscribe to this channel. And if you if you want to hear more about this besides subscribing, maybe you're not ready to join the EFA Society, but maybe you do want to sign up for my free newsletter. If you do, you'll receive a PDF copy of The Path and the Power, which is my newest completed book about, it's an interpretation of the Tao Te Ching. You could see it as a kind of a companion to the Magician's I Ching. It's an interpretation and commentary on the Tao Te Ching, where it talks a lot about De, about virtue, because that's the De in the Tao Te Ching, right? The path and the power. The power is virtue, right? So you'll get that completely free if you sign up for the newsletter. The newsletter itself is free, and all that it'll send you is 1 or 2 emails a month showing some of the teachings I've done in different social media or links to those, and occasionally completely original teaching that will only go to people in the newsletter, little notes and things like that that might be of use to some of you if you're interested. So check that out, subscribe, and feel free to share this video. Thank you very much.